families, creating a lifetime of memories. Sadly, some families are denied these important moments due to the sad practice of alienation. These are families divided.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Families Divided TV. On this week's episode, Dr. Lynn Steinberg is joining us in her first time on Families Divided, and we're happy to have her. Dr. Lynn Steinberg has been successful in assisting winning cases of parental alienation in the court system for 15 years. She conducts reunifications between parents and alienated children, which have also been successful. Dr. Steinberg speaks internationally and writes about the subject of parental alienation. Her book, You're Not Crazy, Overcoming Parental Child Alienation, was written to help parents recognize and deal with the problem. And in this presentation, she's going to share her experiences and give alienated parents valuable information on how to successfully represent themselves in court by getting their best team together. Finally, she talks about parental alienation in the world and which countries are creating laws against this terrible problem. We're going to be right back with Dr. Lynn Steinberg right after these important messages.
Divorce and co-parenting are a major life interruption for families, especially the kids, but also for parents and grandparents. And it's even worse in blame-filled, high-conflict cases. When parents engage in alienation by turning the kids against the other parent or grandparents, kids suffer. They're denied the opportunity to build the 4 big skills necessary for future resilience. New Ways for Families online class can help. Parents learn to use our popular BIF and EAR skills to calm the conflict and stop the hostile emails and texts. And we even have a class for kids and parents to learn together. Research shows a 75% improvement in joint parental decision-making after this course is taken, plus overall improvements for kids' well-being. Don't wait to make this affordable investment in your children's future and improve your well-being too. Start learning new ways for your family today at conflictplaybook.com.
Hello, I appreciate your presence today, and I'd like to extend my gratitude to Elaine for hosting me. In high conflict custody battles, the pivotal factor often revolves around proving parental alienation in the courts. This discussion is to guide you in navigating this complex problem, whether you are representing yourself or have legal representation. To begin, it's crucial to emphasize the significance of assembling a strong support team. To begin, it's important to engage an attorney who's well-versed in the nuances of parental alienation. As the client, don't hesitate to inquire about the attorney's specific knowledge and experience in handling cases involving parental alienation. Simply having a family law attorney, even one with years of practice and experience, will not do the job. It's important to understand what parental alienation is. Parental alienation is counterintuitive, and that's something an attorney really does need to understand. What you see is not what you get. A child may appear to be bonded to one parent, the alienator, but in reality, they may be pathologically aligned with that parent. If your attorney does not grasp this dynamic, they are not adequately able to represent you in court. And it's not your responsibility to educate them. In my book, You're Not Crazy, I provide a list of questions tailored to ask for information from attorneys and therapists to aid in your efforts to hire the correct professionals for your team. And I will discuss how to hire an expert witness as well a little further on in the talk. There are 3 steps to winning a case. 1, having the court find parental alienation. That means the judge says, yes, there is parental alienation in this case, and it's in the transcripts. Exposing the alienator. And if you don't feel comfortable doing this, then an expert can do it. Providing a treatment program. There's a little controversy about this, but if the judge asks, then you can tell him what treatment programs you've investigated and what you would like to do in terms of reunifying with your child or children. By being meticulous, you increase the odds of winning your battle. In proving parental alienation, here are some fallacies or misinformation or fake news that you will be up against. 1, parental alienation does not exist. Well, that's a fallacy. It does exist. We all know it exists. But that is one of the things that the anti-PA people say. PA doesn't exist. We want it erased from the English language. Parental alienation syndrome is junk science. There's plenty of science to back us up. Parental alienation has been debunked. The only people who have debunked parental alienation is the other side, the anti-PA people. Domestic violence or abuse must be ruled out. Well, if there is domestic violence or abuse of the child, then it's not parental alienation we're talking about. That's abuse. Before considering, it's not possible to distinguish alienation from estrangement. That's not true. Estrangement is when a child is legitimately estranged from a parent who has actually been abusive. And by that, I mean that abuse has to be proved in the court. People cannot say there is abuse here and not have it verified. That's not the way it works or should work. Parental alienation cannot be diagnosed or identified because it's not in the DSM-5. Well, that is absolute nonsense because parental alienation syndromes are not in the DSM-5. What you do as a clinician is you diagnose individuals. And there's a number of diagnoses that can be used to describe parental alienation. And if you need those, I can certainly provide that for you. Parental alienation is not supported by empirical research. That's not true either. We have a plethora of empirical research showing alienation, and actually, Dr. Kathleen Ray and Dr. William Burnett were on the show just a few weeks ago where they talked about a measurement that they use that identifies parental alienation in a family. Parental alienation does not pass the Darbert-Frye gatekeeping. This is a legal concept where an expert is asked certain questions about the case, and it has to pass a certain level in order to be accepted by the courts. Men do not alienate, only women, or vice versa. None of that is true. There's almost an equal amount of men and women who both alienate and who are alienated. It's not gender specific. Bad behavior equals parental alienation. That's not true either. Professional or clinical intuition is sufficient to resolve parental alienation. That relates to therapists who have not been trained, but either say there's no parental alienation or there is parental alienation, and actually they don't know what they're talking about, because unless you know the dynamics and you've been trained in this area, you're not able to identify parental alienation. And tuition doesn't work anyway. Tuition is just as good as a bystander's opinion on the matter who knows nothing about the case. So you have to have facts to back up what's happening. Parental alienation is defined as a dynamic in which a child has aligned with one parent and rejected the other parent for no legitimate reason. Some people would include as a result of undue influence in their definition. In other words, they would define parental alienation as a family dynamic in which, as a result of undue influence by one parent, a child is resisting a relationship with or otherwise rejecting the other parent for no legitimate reason. So clearly that's about the alienator alienating a child against the other parent. A key point here is that many alienating parents, especially the most determined and severe alienators, have one or more underlying personality disorders, such as borderline, narcissistic, sociopathic, psychotic, and on the continuum, of course, psychotic is absolutely the worst personality disorder to have. Another point is to determine whether alienation is mild, moderate, or severe. Mild is usually when the couple first separates and the child is just beginning to learn that one parent doesn't like the other parent and doesn't want the child to like the other parent. And it starts off where the child cries when they go to the alienated parent's house and doesn't want to go back to the alienator because they're hearing nasty things about their other parents. The moderate time is when a parent is being actively rejected by a child. Like, for example, I have a client when he gets on video with his little daughter, she pierces her lips and she frowns and she won't sit in the view of the camera so he can see her or hear her. And she says things like, my mommy is the only parent, and she's 4. That's moderate. Too severe. Severe is when a child refuses to see the other parent because they've been brainwashed about that parent and will parrot whatever the alienator says. And that is when this comes into court, usually, and when parents begin to see that this is parental alienation. One reason it's so important to determine where the alienation is, mild, moderate, or severe, is because in psychology, early intervention is key. So if the courts can determine early on that there is parental alienation and there needs to be some treatment and intervention for it, the chances of it progressing are less than if it gets to the point of being severe. However, parental alienation is progressive, and one can predict a path that it will go down if it's not intervened on. That would be a serious professional error. In fact, the technical term for this is pathological enmeshment, which is neither normal nor healthy in the relationship between the alienator and the child. So how can you prove parental alienation in the court? One way is to use the 5-factor model. And I use that, and I think a lot of clinicians do, to be able to describe what's going on in the family as a diagnostic tool. It's been validated in research, and it's theoretically sound. The reason it's important is that you want to document parental alienation, and using the five key factors in most cases are the first factors to consider and document. So factor one is when the child manifests contact resistance or refusal. For example, avoids a relationship with one of the parents. Factor two, the presence of prior positive relationship with the alienated parent and the child, and that alienated parent is now the rejected parent. Factor three, there's no abuse in the history between the alienated parent and the child. Factor four, the alienator has used multiple alienating behaviors against the alienated parent, and the child is parroting what the alienator says. And factor five, the child is exhibiting manifestations of alienation, and I'll go over what those are as well. Factor four is the use of behaviors that alienators use. So what are they? Well, Dr. Amy Baker came up with 17 alienating strategies that an alienator will use. And it's not important that you cross off all these behaviors. What's important is whether or not the behavior has been used strongly against an alienated parent by the alienating parent. So, for example, if the alienator is constantly bad-mouthing the other parent and does it all the time, that's just as strong as it is if all 17 of the behaviors are used. So, for example, I'll read them off here if it's helpful. Bad-mouthing, limiting contact. I think most of you will know what that means. Interfering with communication, like staying around when the child's on the phone with you or on the video. Interfering with symbolic communications, which is like hugging a parent when a child refuses to hug a parent. Withdrawal of love, won't say to a parent that they love that parent. Telling child targeted parent does not love him or her. This is something that is truly tragic, and many alienators would say, well, your father doesn't love you or your mother doesn't love you. If she did, she wouldn't be doing this. Forcing a child to choose between two parents, creating the impression that the targeted parent is dangerous. And how do they do that? They say they listen to an account and, sorry about that. They listen to an account of how the weekend went, and then they will say, oh, you must have been so afraid. Didn't your dad or your mom do anything about that? You must have been really scared. Next time you're scared, you just call me, okay? And I'll come and pick you up. Or I'll call your mom or dad and tell them that you're really afraid. That's how they instill fear when there's nothing to be afraid of. And if they were afraid, they could tell the parent, and the parent would probably do anything. So the correct response would be, oh, get your daddy on the phone, or here, let me call your mom and tell them that that's how you're feeling. Or can you do it by yourself? I'm sure it's fine. So that's the correct way to do it. Confiding in a child. I'm sure you know that alienators will share court information and tell them what happened at court, or give them information about what they say is bad about that other parent that the child should never be privy to. Asking a child to spy on a targeted parent. I know a alienated parent, who has had to, for years now, change her password and email because her daughter gets on her computer when she's not looking and will give all that information to the father, who then just logs on to the mom's computer information. So that's what she has to do: change her phone number, change her email address, and everything else on a regular basis. Forcing the child to reject the targeted parent. Spine I covered. Asking the child to keep secrets from the other parent, referring to the targeted parent by their first name. And I have a story here. I saw this family, there were 6 kids, and I knew the dad's name, but the children addressed him as Robert. And at a certain point, I said, "Who's Robert?" And they laughed and they said, "Oh, that's what we call him." And I said, "You mean your dad? Do you call your dad Robert? That's not his name." And they said, "Oh, well, our mom suggested that that's what we call him." Now, that's very dehumanizing. It's also pushing their dad completely out of the family, completely rejecting him, not even calling him, if they had to call him by the first name, calling him by the wrong first name. And one of the things I do when I see families like this, I say, "Oh, no, this is not acceptable. We're going to call your dad Dad. He's your dad. So every time you say Robert or call him by his first name, I'm going to stop you and say, address your dad as Dad." And that kind of shifts the power dynamic, giving the parent back some of the control and the power. And how insulting is that for children to not even call their dad by his real name or even Dad? Referring to a step parent as mom or dad, withholding medical, academic, and other important information, changing the child's name, their last name, sometimes even their first name, to remove any association with the alienated parent, and cultivating a dependency on the alienator. And I have seen this to include children not going off to college because they have to keep their parent company, and then just continue living with that alienating parent, which is really sad. And then I think a strategy which is not under the 17 is one that I've added because I see this so often, and that's making a child over-entitled, over-important, over-empowered. So this is when you see the children saying things like, "Well, this is my decision. I'm refusing to see my dad or my mom. I'm not ever going to live with them. And when I'm 14, I'm going to be refusing to even see them or live with them." By the way, that is not what the law says. It does not say a child can choose where to live when they're 14 years old. They can only represent themselves to the judge and give the judge their opinion. Hopefully, the judge knows better and that this is a parental alienation case. And the American Bar Association did a study And they published that study, and they found that 86% of alienated children will simply parrot what the alienator has told them to say and not tell the truth, and certainly not say what their real opinion is, because they will be punished if they do. So it's better not to have children testify at all. They always end up feeling ashamed and guilty for the lies they told about a parent, or what they said about a parent which was not their real feelings. And that's a very hard thing to overcome for a child. One example of alienating children against a parent was a mother who conducted a funeral and a symbolic burial of the father with the children. That's extreme, and it makes your blood run cold. So what are the manifestations in children? One is the denigration of a rejected parent, which we've just talked about. And when there's severe alienation, there's a whole campaign of denigration of a parent. And I have seen, like, for example, physicians losing their medical license because these children have managed to campaign against the father and say, or a mother, and say that there's sexual abuse going on, and that parent is an alcoholic and a drug user, and all of which is false and impacts that parent tremendously, as you can imagine. The child rationalizes their behavior with excuses that are weak, trivial, frivolous, or absurd. So one example I had was the dad took the kid to see the grandma in Hawaii, and that was the child's complaint, and that was the child's description of being abused. And I asked if the child was happy to be in Hawaii. Oh yeah, I love being in Hawaii. Well, how about your grandma? Had you seen your grandma recently? No, and I love my grandma, and it was so great, and goes on and on about what a wonderful trip it was. But this is what the child is describing as abuse of them. So sometimes it's just absurd what the accusations are. There's a lack of ambivalence. They're very black and white about issues. There's an absence of guilt or remorse for the way they're treating the rejected parents. And when I do the reunifications, one of the things is I try to instill empathy with the children. I say, well, how did you feel when that happened? Well, how do you think your parent feels when that happened? So they begin to learn how to empathize with what's going on, especially their rejection of that parent, and understand that their parent is suffering because of that. Borrowed scenarios or borrowed language, children will use the same language as the alienator does. Reflexive support for the favored parent in almost any situation. So no matter what the alienator does, the children support it and come up with some rationalizations as to why they're supporting that parent. The independent thinker model. This is when the children say, I came to this conclusion all on my own, and yet the words they are using are so sophisticated and so legal, that for that age level, that child is not able to really come up with that. And so it's not their words that are being said. And then a very sad factor is that children will reject the whole side of an alienated parent's family and friends and even pets. So people, grandparents who are very close to their grandchildren, that child is saying that they no longer want to see the grandparents anymore, or the pet, or whoever's associated with that parent. So the next step is that you want to document everything. You need to be organized. You need to make lists. You can use some detail, but it's more important to be concise. And this is a lesson that I learned with judges. There was a very famous expert witness who was retained before me, and he wrote a report that was almost 300 pages long, and the judge just threw him and the report out. So it's important to be concise. Don't go on and on and on because you'll lose people's attention. Focus on the main points, but leave any details for later. If you're asked about it, you can get into more detail. And as an alienated parent, you can probably become pretty tangential about things. I think that when alienated parents first start talking about what's going on with them, they can be very detailed and want to give you all the examples. And it's very understandable because they've just realized what's going on and they're putting it all together. But put it all together in a therapist or a friend's office. Don't try to use it in court because you'll lose the judge's attention. Prioritize your list by making 10 to 12 important points that you want the court evaluator to know. Make a list of the 5 factors which we went over and how that is specific to your case. Make a list of violations of court orders. Alienators think that court orders don't apply to them. So document all violations of court orders. Make a list of all the misrepresentations to the children that the alienator has made. Make a list of critical incidences and harassments and include the dates and times. Use evidence such as texts and emails. Keep a list of times and dates. You want to pick your child up. You went to pick your child up and they refused to go or didn't show up for the visit. Were there times that the alienator interrupted your parenting time with the child? Were there times that the other parent limited contact, especially during COVID when court orders were still in place? Get together letters and cards and emails, etc. for the child. When you see the child, it's helpful to show them all of that because I've seen children completely mesmerized by photographs of the good times and the relationship that they did have with the alienated parent. List all of the documents in date order and make a list of the reason for the hearing. Now, this is really helpful for an expert to have. The more organized you are, the more money you can save so that the expert doesn't have to organize all the material. Have police records in date order and a list of what the consequences were, whether they were dismissed or not. Have a list of Child Protective Service reports and what the outcome was. Again, the more clear that is for an expert, the more money you're going to save. Document in a way that it's easy to see that you are a victim of constant harassment and false accusations. Have a list of audios and videos that provide proof of an event. Even though the courts don't accept and won't look at these videos or recordings, the expert can and can document that in the reports. Get declarations from teachers, therapists, anyone who can support your point of view, and verify your character and your parenting. Compile communications from the alienator and what your child has written to you since the alienation to compare and provide proof of your relationship with your children now. So an alienator 6 months ago could be saying, I love you, I want to be with you for the rest of my life. Yes, I want to get married. And now they're writing these horrible, awful emails saying that you're not a good enough parent and your child hates you and never wants to see you again. So show how quickly it went from one extreme to another. And all this information will really assist your attorney and an expert witness if you have one. So it's really important to conduct yourself well in court, because an alienator will come in and appear to be completely in control and calm and charming, and the way personality disorders are, they can really seduce and manipulate people. So don't come in when you're angry and hostile and you want to prove a point and you're going to interrupt the judge. Be as cool, calm, and collected as the alienator is, because they will unravel if you are not fazed by anything that's going on and you just continue to present the facts of the situation versus what your opinion is. Because judges can really be swayed by alienators. I had one situation where I was allowed to sit in on the alienator's testimony, and she had, quote unquote, fainted the day before, and they had to call the ambulance, but she didn't want to go with them. She wanted to bravely continue her testimony. And when I was listening to her, she started hyperventilating and fanning herself and looking like she was going to fall out of her chair. And she was describing what her ex-husband had, quote unquote, done to her. And this was being pushed up against the wall, she said. So you can see the judge was very impressed by this behavior and didn't take my word for it that it was really dramatic and probably not true because of the way she was acting. And of course, the woman's lawyer accused me of all kinds of things, like, not understanding domestic violence or not being sympathetic toward women, and none of which is true. But once they paint themselves as victims in the court, it's important to dispel the notion that they are the victim in this situation. And it doesn't help to be super nice about it. Just be truthful, say it like it is, say that never happened, Your Honor. She's never complained about me mistreating her until now. I've never seen her faint before. I've never seen her hyperventilate and fan herself when she's talking about what supposedly happened. So just be calm, just be collected, and talk to the judge like you understand what's going on, but you're also saying it never happened. So in terms of choosing an attorney, I want to give you an example of what an experienced attorney did that really blew the case. He decided not to use the words parental alienation. He avoided claiming that parental alienation was child abuse. He simply described behavior with respect to the parents and children, as opposed to labeling the behavior as parental alienation and as the alienated parent being alienated. He avoided referring to published articles or books on alienation, which would have proved the scientific evidence of parental alienation. He avoided using an expert witness to explain alienation and what the scientific issues were and how to identify it and distinguish it from realistic estrangement, which is realistic abuse, not false allegations, and why it's present in this situation. So if a lawyer does this, they call it taking the high road. 99% of the time, you will fail at trying to see your children. It doesn't work. And there's a lot of data to validate that. So if you have a lawyer who talks about, well, let's do the right thing, let's take the high road, don't listen. You need to say the way things are and have the judge know what's going on. So this brings me to choosing an expert. And it's important to choose the right expert because they can competently teach the court about parental alienation. There's two kinds of experts. One is a general expert, where the expert will know nothing about your case, but will go in just to educate the judge about parental alienation and answer any questions. And sometimes the experts aren't accepted because a judge will say, oh, I know everything there is to know about parental alienation, so we won't hear from the quote unquote experts. The advantage of having a general expert is that they cannot be biased because they don't know anything about the case. They're just talking about parental alienation. And a lot of what I will talk about is how the judge can expect to see the child. Like if the child is testifying, they can expect a complete exaggeration, a lot of lies, a lot of false allegations, and all this to please the alienator. And judges are usually pretty interested in that, especially if they've heard something terrible from the child. I was accused of bias when I testified as a general witness because the father was transgender. I didn't even know that. And a so-called journalist accused me of being biased against the transgender community. So I guess somebody can still accuse you of something even when it doesn't exist. I know that. Then there's the case-specific expert, and they try to also be non-biased by not talking with any of the family members and just going over every single document in the case. So all those documents I talked about that you need to organize and have available for the attorneys and the experts, the experts use all that material and know the case inside and out. So when they go to court, they can talk specifically about what has happened, what the history is of both the parents. What happens that the children are now only with one parent, even though they're still 50-50 custody, and what the alienator is doing, exposing the alienator, like how are they enabling the children not to see the other parent. And also, if the judge wants to know, recommending the treatment. for reunifying the alienated parent and the children. It's important to choose an expert that will impress the judge, because if the expert is not trained, educated, has experience in both being an expert witness and in working with parental alienation, the judge is either going to not allow that expert to testify or find the testimony not credible. So choose someone, and there are quite a lot of experts around who are very credible and experienced. Choose someone who's going to be an outstanding expert who has outstanding credentials and education. And this has come under scrutiny lately because the opponents of parental alienation are passing this law called Cadence Law, which writes them in as experts. So they are saying all they need to do to be an expert is know about domestic violence and know the case somewhat. That's not an expert. And more judges' discretion is being taken away from them. And if it's a law that they have to accept these so-called experts, then they won't be able to say anything about it and, not allow that expert into the courtroom, which they've done up until this point. So choose someone that has a lot of weight behind them, and the judge won't dismiss and will hear about your case. It's better to have an expert who knows everything about your case, because that expert will stand up under cross-examination very well. And they can answer questions about diagnoses, which maybe you wouldn't know enough about the DSM-5 or what certain behaviors are indicative of. And it can be a very powerful part of the presentation of your case in court. So I want to give a couple of more pointers. Well, I want to say first that alienated parents are the most misdiagnosed and misrepresented clients in the mental health and law communities, because they're so upset, because they cry easily or get angry easily. Clinicians will misdiagnose them as being borderline personality disorders. I've run into this time and time again, where there's no history of having any kind of personality disturbance, but because this is the way they're acting now, they will be misdiagnosed. So there again, it's important to use a therapist who will be able to diagnose appropriately and see that this is just the state of the way things are right now, and not that this person has traits which would enable them to diagnose a personality disorder. You need to have traits in order to diagnose a personality disorder. And parental alienation is a state of affairs that is probably the worst thing anybody will ever experience. So a few other pointers is don't let your child read any of the material from the courts, and don't confide in them about it. Don't give them any information. Keep your communication with the alienator down as much as you can. If they harass you a lot, block them and let them write what they want to on our family wizard or talking parents, which is through the court. And you can just reply there. I don't think that anybody reads those, even though it's great evidence. Probably your expert witness will, so that they can testify to that. And don't agree to allow your child to testify in court. There's a lot of trained psychologists, therapists who will write a statement to the court talking about how detrimental this is to a child. The way the law is right now, children can talk to the judge in the judge's chambers without lawyers present and without a stenographer present. And hopefully the judge will know enough about interviewing a child and deciphering what's true and what isn't true, and be able to render some kind of decision. But children should never testify in court. They remember that forever, and you probably will as well. And you will probably have to forgive your child for what they said at some point. So that finishes how to prove alienation in courts. And I wanted to talk about how alienation is being proved in the world. The way it's being proved is through legislation. And there are a few countries worldwide that do have laws against parental alienation. There aren't many, and hopefully it will increase as the years go by. But the people who do have laws against it are pretty surprising countries. For example, India, Malta, Denmark, Brazil, Mexico, Gibraltar, Puerto Rico, and Italy. And maybe you're curious about how these countries did get laws through. And I would like to read to you an account of one alienated dad who managed to change the law, and that was in Puerto Rico. He said, "My divorce lawyer and I worked as a team. We have a friend who is close with the sponsoring legislator, and that relationship was very important in shepherding the legislation through the Congress, as it almost died in the end. I also put popular Democratic pressure on key committee legislators at key moments to push the bill through at key moments. I used Facebook and urged constituents to respectfully contact the legislators and the Senate committee, and be at the Senate committee hearings where I testified. And I filed a memo into the record explaining how the bill, as written, needed to be modified lest it fail. Other constituent groups also helped: psychologists, social workers, bar associations who testified at the hearing, and a Senate committee hearing member was champion of the law, which is key in getting most legislation passed. Champion legislators to push legislation through. So obviously, you need legislators. You need to talk to them about the problem. You need to ask them to please carry a bill. And that's the way you will get a law through. And there's somebody else I need to mention. His name is Robert Garza, and he's out of Texas. And he has been pretty much a one-man show. He wrote a bill, and it's called Time Lost, Time Gained. And this cut through a lot of the problems in Texas. And I think this is really the answer to what we need to do, is just cut through all the problems and all the terrible bills that are coming in to say that PA doesn't exist and mothers should be the only ones to get children, and Yeah, I can spend a whole session talking about that. But what he did, along with this radio personality by the name of Eric Carroll, he has a show called Dads Speak. And they got in the car and they went from state to state and talked to legislators and pushed this bill, which was adopted in Texas, and he's working on having it adopted federally. And it's so simple. It just says time lost, time gained. So any time that the alienator withholds the children or the children don't show up for the alienated parent, for custody time, for visitation, it will simply be given back to the alienated parent, no questions asked. So you can see it doesn't have to go through all kinds of bodies like the courts or child welfare or whoever fights it at this time. So he is trying to get that bill through, and I think it's quite a brilliant way to do it. The other people who are trying to get bills through and have had success in certain rates are the equal parenting proponents. And of course, they propose that each parent can parent their child, no questions asked. And I think introducing laws like that will just cut through all the fighting that has been going on, all the terrible bills that have gotten passed and will be passed probably in the next year or so, is just to create some really good legislation. We tried to get a bill picked up in California which would require all professionals who work with children to have training in parental alienation. And I think that would have cut through all the problems as well. But we didn't manage to get it through and kind of ran out of energy trying to do that. So I want to also tell you about Denmark, because Denmark recently, Danish Fathers Association filed a suit against the Ministry of Social Affairs and the Prime Minister's office because parents were being discriminated against and were not seeing their children. So at this time, and they have a law against parental alienation, but I guess it wasn't being enforced to the satisfaction of this group. And so they went ahead and filed a suit against the Prime Minister, which I think is great. And there's several states who have passed the law, equal parenting law. So that concludes my presentation, and I hope I get invited back to talk about all the legislation that's going on and also treatment. So thank you for listening, and hope to see you again soon.
Next week on Families Divided TV, Melanie Gill joins us to discuss how trauma is overdiagnosed as ASD, or ADHD, in children subject to parental alienation and conflict.